By this point in the course, one thing should already be clear. Profiling is not guesswork, and it is not a dramatic attempt to see into the mind of an unknown offender. In the first lesson, we established that profiling begins with behavior and with the chain of decisions that shapes the crime. In the second lesson, we moved beneath the visible act and examined the internal mechanisms that may drive violent behavior: motivation, fantasy, emotional tension, control, and escalation. Now we move to a practical question. If offenders differ in how they think, plan, react, and use violence, how do investigators organize those differences in a useful way? This is where typologies enter the picture. Typologies are tools for structured thinking. They help analysts compare patterns, identify recurring features, and organize large amounts of behavioral information. Used properly, they can sharpen attention and improve investigative reasoning. Used badly, they become stereotypes, and stereotypes are dangerous. The purpose of typology is not to place every offender into a neat box. The purpose is to clarify which behavioral pattern fits the evidence best and where that pattern begins to break down. This distinction matters immediately. Real offenders are often mixed, unstable, or inconsistent. Some begin in a controlled way and become chaotic under pressure. Others appear impulsive at first, but reveal underlying structure when the full sequence is reconstructed. That is why typologies should never replace analysis. They should support it. One of the best-known distinctions in homicide analysis is between the organized and disorganized offender. The reason this distinction became influential is simple. It reflects visible differences in behavior. An organized offender tends to show planning, movement control, greater awareness of evidence, and a more coherent offense sequence. A disorganized offender tends to show impulsivity, confusion, poor scene management, and a more chaotic interaction with the victim or environment. At first glance, this distinction seems useful, and often it is. A more organized crime scene may suggest planning capacity, emotional control at the outset, familiarity with risk, or a stronger ability to translate fantasy into action. A more disorganized scene may suggest overload, panic, limited control, poor preparation, severe impulsivity, or rapid emotional escalation. But the distinction becomes dangerous the moment it is treated too rigidly. Real crimes do not always stay on one side of the line. An offender may plan the approach and lose control during resistance. Another may begin chaotically, but still remove evidence afterward. Another may appear calm simply because the victim was quickly overpowered, not because the offender was psychologically stable. This is why the profiler must always ask, organized in which phase, and disorganized in response to what? That phase-based thinking is crucial. Before the offense, during the offense, and after the offense may reveal very different levels of control. A person may be methodical before the event, unstable during it, and highly defensive afterward. Another may be reckless in the approach, focused during the act, and careless in the aftermath. Once behavior is divided across phases, typology becomes more precise. Another useful distinction concerns motivation-based patterns. Some offenders are primarily grievance-driven. Others are domination-driven. Others are strongly reactive, acting under acute emotional overload. Others show instrumental logic, where the victim becomes part of a goal rather than the emotional center of the offense. These patterns matter because the same act, homicide, can emerge from very different psychological structures. A grievance-driven offender often builds internal justification over time. The violence may be linked to humiliation, resentment, rejection, or a perceived moral injury. The offender may feel wronged, deprived, insulted, or erased. In these cases, the act often has a strong internal logic for the offender, even if that logic is deeply distorted. The homicide is not only violence. It is experienced as correction, retaliation, restoration, or release. A domination-driven offender is different. Here, the psychological reward may come less from grievance itself and more from control, superiority, fear induction, or total asymmetry between offender and victim. The offense may function as an experience of power. In these cases, the behavioral pattern often reveals a stronger interest in managing the victim, prolonging control, or shaping the interaction beyond what would be necessary if the only goal were to kill. Reactive offenders show another pattern. These are not necessarily people without prior tension or fantasy, but offenders whose violence is more tightly linked to rapid emotional flooding, poor regulation, low frustration tolerance, and weak behavioral breaks under pressure. The sequence is often faster, less stable, and more vulnerable to disruption. Their actions may reveal urgency rather than structure. Instrumental offenders represent yet another pattern. In such cases, violence may be part of a broader practical objective: elimination of a witness, removal of an obstacle, financial gain, or another perceived advantage. This does not make the offense psychologically empty. It means that the emotional center of the crime may be different. The victim may be treated less as the focus of internal conflict and more as a barrier within a larger plan. These distinctions are useful because they force the analyst to ask better questions. Is the violence expressive or controlled? Is it overloaded with emotion or functionally directed? Does the offender seem to seek release, domination, completion of a plan, or some combination of all three? The more clearly these questions are asked, the less likely the analysis is to collapse into vague storytelling. At the same time, the profiler must remain cautious. Typologies are maps, not reality itself. A map helps orientation, but it simplifies the terrain. The same is true here. Offenders move across categories. Some change over time. Some combine elements from several types. Some offenses are shaped less by stable personality structure and more by immediate stress, substance use, opportunity, interpersonal collapse, or situational panic. That is why behavior always comes first. If the evidence points in one direction and the typology points in another, the evidence wins. A useful typology sharpens observation. A bad typology blinds the analyst by making them see only what they expect to see. This is also where confirmation bias becomes especially dangerous. Once an investigator labels someone mentally as organized, disorganized, sadistic, reactive, or instrumental, there is a temptation to interpret every later detail in ways that preserve the label. But real behavioral analysis requires the opposite attitude. Every label must remain provisional. Every interpretation stay open to correction. The question is never, which typology do I prefer? It simply improves the structure of thought. The best use of typology is therefore comparative, not absolute.
It helps analysts narrow possibilities, identify likely dynamics, and clarify what kind of offender behavior is more or less consistent with the data.
It does not identify a specific person, and it does not eliminate the need for evidence. It simply improves the structure of thought. This makes typology especially valuable in homicide investigations, where emotional intensity can distort judgment. A clear behavioral framework helps investigators stay analytical when the case itself pushes toward reaction, assumption, and narrative closure. It brings discipline back into the room. And that is the real lesson here. Typologies matter not because they give us certainty, but because they help us think more clearly under uncertainty. They allow us to compare offender patterns without pretending that all offenders are the same. They help us organize differences in planning, control, motive, emotional regulation, and operational style. But they only remain useful as long as they stay subordinate to behavior. So, by now, the structure of the course is becoming clearer. First, we establish that profiling begins with decisions and behavioral sequence. Then, we examined the psychological mechanisms that can shape those decisions before the crime becomes visible. Now we have added a third layer: structured comparison between offender patterns. The next step is to bring these layers together. In the final lesson, we move from theory into applied behavioral reading. We will look at how analysts interpret crime scene patterns in practice, how behavior before, during, and after the offense forms a meaningful sequence, and why the smallest details often become valuable only when placed inside the full logic of the event. That is where profiling becomes most powerful, not in labels, not in myths, but in disciplined interpretation of behavior across the entire timeline of the crime.